And we are back for part two. Welcome back for Master's Class, part two of Empire Building in Africa, otherwise known as the Scramble for Africa. So we're going to pick up with Central and East Africa. So let's see what's going on here. In Central Africa, we start to see a little bit of a shift. There's a lot of attention and action going on in North Africa as far as colonization goes. As we get into Central Africa, the imagination, I would say that this is really where like the imagination of the worldwide public, worldwide media comes into play. It sparks the imagination, it gets the average individual interested in Africa, as far as the purposes of, these stories of the white man's burden, trying to bring civilization, right? This sort of racist narrative that is very prevalent at this time. And there are individuals who are trying to legitimately do good works. There are also individuals who are just kind of there for sating their own adventurous spirit and seeing a part of the world that is not very well documented at this time. And then there are those individuals who are really looking to capitalize, to make profit, to earn, to colonize, and to imperialize. And so we're going to talk about a chain of individuals here that perhaps leads from the adventurous spirit of somebody who is intellectually curious, to someone who is financially driven for sure, and then to somebody who is driven financially and as a means to build up the power of their country, their nation, as well as their wealth and their prestige at any cost, especially at the cost of millions of humans' lives. So let's talk about one David Livingstone, who is going to explore the dense tropical jungles of Central Africa for a 30-year period. He begins when he's just 27 years old. He's something of a medical missionary, and for certain, he buys in to the white man's burden narrative. He buys into this idea that, the white man is supposed to come into, Africa and lift them up, to civilize, to introduce Christianity via good works as well. And he's able to do this, one, because of primarily what we talked about before in part one of the lecture series, quinine. Quinine is going to allow, to a large degree, these people like David Livingstone, pictured here, to travel inward, much further inward into Africa. And here you can see various depictions of David Livingstone, and his both being photographed as well as being depicted in the issues that he would face in Africa. Now, granted, I don't think he was so stony-faced, encountering the wilderness and the jungles of Africa, but this is definitely how the British would want for him to be portrayed. That you sort of take whatever's going to come at you with a stiff upper lip, old chap. And so he is going to trek through the regions of a largely uncharted for, outside Europeans' interest, that is, throughout Central Africa, traveling by foot, travels by canoe, but mostly by foot, exploring the interior. And as a result of these travels, we're going to find that this is going to allow a lot of information to be digested overseas back in Europe, particularly in England, and therefore maps will have to be redrawn based on his eyewitness accounts and his reports. So the map of Africa, as far as outside of Africa goes, and therefore for the rest of the world, is going to be heavily redrawn and reshaped till it was given its modern contemporary shape that we see here on my screen. So a major goal is to find a navigable river that's going to open Central Africa to European commerce and therefore also to Christianity. And that's probably Livingstone's biggest goal right there, to open up Africa more of it to Christianity. So I mean, we already have the Suez Canal, right? That's opening up trade to India and Southeast Asia. Well, what about into Central Africa if you're trying to get into Central Africa? So that's what he's trying to do, is find that main navigable river. Well, this eventually will happen, especially with the advent of steamships traversing in through Central Africa. And of course, when you couple that with quinine, this is going to be, a reality. This is going to be a more achievable goal. But it takes somebody, for the Europeans, that is, for outside interests, like Dr. David Livingstone, to travel and report. Now, he's been at this for so long, 30-year stretch, but he's been at this for so long that, and we can just go back a page right here, when he starts in 1841, that he has captured the imagination, right, of outside interests, so much to the point that it's not just, because he's English that he's captured English interests. In America, the United States, the New York Herald is going to hire a young journalist by the name of Henry Stanley, and he is going to blow up the story of Dr. David Livingstone because he interjects himself into the narrative, and it's sensational. This is a very sensationalized story for the time, and it's led to one of the greatest historic quotes of all time as well. It's one of the most quotable quotes in history. So he is going to be hired by the New York Herald to find him, because Dr. David Livingstone apparently has become lost. It's been quite some time since his last communique, and the European and American world, they want to know, has he fallen? Has he met his fate? And then, of course, the imagination runs wild. Who did he succumb to? Did he succumb to a cannibalistic, bloodthirsty tribe that he was supposed to civilize and uplift? Once again, this feeds into the kind of narrative that existed at the time. Or was it simply like he fell into a pit, he got mauled to death by a lion? Or is he in fact still alive and well? Is he trapped somewhere? The world wants to know, and clearly there's money and financial interest to support Henry Stanley in this exploration. And sure enough, as he ventures into Central Africa, on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika, he is going to find Dr. David Livingstone. And he says those famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," and here is a famous depiction of that meeting as he finds them. And you can see from this account as well, if we can pull this up, and here we have an image of Henry Stanley, and we saw that famous depiction of his meeting with Dr. Livingstone. So as he arrives, if we can go back, you'll find that he doesn't really have a lot of love, and it's odd because Henry Stanley, I think this is the problem with his financial motivation here. He does not have a lot of love for Africa. Let's just put it that way. So he is going to find Dr. David Livingstone, and he reaches him. Livingstone is, kind of ailing. He's not doing the best, but he's certainly not the worst. And you can see that this kind of captures the racial tensions. This quote from Henry Stanley, as he is going to encounter, right before he encounters Dr. David Livingstone. So he has this guide with him by the name of Selim, and he says, quote, "I see the doctor, sir. Oh, what an old man. He has a white beard. And what would I not have given for a bit of friendly wilderness where, unseen," and this is this weird thing, where Henry Stanley doesn't want the Africans who are in his employ, who are helping him trek, to see him experience this sort of maddening joy, right, at finding Dr. Livingstone, that his journey might actually be over so he can get out of here. There's this thing about trying to show that no matter what is thrown at him as an outsider, and more importantly as a white man, that he doesn't react or give into, what he might consider, foolish emotions. So he wants to show that he is stoic. He wants to show that he is in control of his emotions. He doesn't want his emotions to betray him in front of these African guides. So this is what he's talking about. He's trying to prevent those nearly uncontrollable and exciting feelings that he's experiencing as he realizes, oh, my journey might actually finally be over here. And so he says, my heart beats fast, but I must not let my face betray my emotions, lest it shall detract from the dignity of a white man appearing under such extraordinary circumstances. So I did what cowardice and false pride suggested was the best thing. Walked deliberately to him, took off my hat, and said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? To which he replied, yes, with a kind smile, lifting his cap slightly. So right here you can see, it's very interesting that, of course you're excited, but it's so important for him to appear a certain way, right? So there is now this narrative of how a white man is expected to appear and to conduct himself and to act, even in unexplored, as far as an American goes, certainly, territory under extraordinary circumstances. And this is, once again, like we keep, I'm repeating this, but this is a prevailing narrative for this time. And this kind of falls in line with the stiff upper lip, take what life gives you, be stony faced, be stoic, be heroic. Even if you are absolutely terrified, don't let those around you, it's one of those things where he doesn't want to overreact to something that is so common and everyday and the norm for the people who surround him. He doesn't want them to laugh at him or to accuse him of cowardice or anything of that kind. So after he finds Livingstone, shortly after, I should say, just a couple of years, Livingstone dies. And Stanley, who is become engrossed, not obsessed in the way you would think, where he's passionate for this thing. It's that he has devoted so much time. He's, written for the New York Herald. He has profited financially from this adventure, and he's had an adventure. And I think it's really hard to sit in an office somewhere and find some beat story in the streets of New York after that. So, of New York City after that. So, Stanley is going to carry on Livingstone's work, right? And this is a way to capitalize on cult celebrity status. He's interjected himself in the narrative. But he hates Africa. Quote, I detest the land most heartily, end quote. He's only here for the money. And we know this because in the 1870s, as he's exploring the Congo River in Central Africa, and he sails down to the Atlantic Ocean, this is going to be his opportunity to see if he can't sell this discovery, right, of his explorations by encouraging the British to send settlers to the Congo River Basin. There's an obvious connect. He's known in England. He's kind of known internationally, but he's really well known in America and England after the whole, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, story. So now, with the British seemingly uninterested in this particular region, he turns to King Leopold II of Belgium. And this is where things take a horrific turn as far as the history of Africa goes. King Leopold II, you can probably see from some of the controversial pictures here, was a brutal tyrant. He is going to, it's not so much Belgium. I mean, we can look at our map here, you know, and it's not so much Belgium that's going to the Belgian Congo, as much as it is really kind of like King Leopold II's private, you know, property. That's really the better way to perceive the Congo. And because he operates in the Congo as though it were his private property, this is going to lead to some horrific events, and then we'll go back to talk about that in just a second here. This is, for him, it's not just the spirit of adventure that captured Stanley, or even the means to want to Christianize. There's not a lot of motivation there. The motivation is more like Henry Stanley's motivation. It is financial. And he is going to take it a step further and demonstrate that in his pursuit to open to civilization the only part of our globe where it has yet to penetrate, to pierce the darkness which envelopes whole populations, it is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this century of progress. Well, he's not bringing civilization. In fact, you could argue quite the opposite. He's there for profit, and he is going to do anything to get it. Rubber is the game. With the advent of bicycles and, of course, the oncoming automobile, rubber is in high demand for tires. Huge. And it has various other applications as well. And so he is going to work to the death the Congolese. And this is going to lead to the deaths of millions and the mutilations of millions of the Congolese to work on these sort of rubber plantations that King Leopold II is going to have set up. And Henry Stanley is going to be hired by him to help set up these settlements in the Congo. So he has, as we can see from the map, a vast territory to exploit, and he will do so. But he is going to compete against France. As you can see, France has, you know, from the west side of North Africa to the west and Central Africa, the French flag has been planted. They've made their presence known. So he is preventing the spread of the French as well as the English, of whom are basically surrounding him. Now, as far as how brutal King Leopold II was in these other Belgian settlers, we need only look but a little, what we can see from these images here. If you are Congolese and you happen to have the misfortune of living in the Belgian Congo at this time, you were open to depredation, you were open to mutilation, quotas were placed on you to work on, you know, these sort of rubber plantations. And if they felt that you were not meeting your quota, you were stealing from the king. And you can see the punishment for theft is the removal of one's hand, if not worse. So King Leopold II, his name is not held in honor in the Free State, in the Congo Free State today. He is synonymous with evil and the worst aspects that capitalism has to offer, the putting of profit over the lives and the well-beings of others. In fact, not just putting profit over the lives and well-beings of others, but really to achieve profit at the cost of the lives of others. So as we move our attention from Central Africa to East Africa, the landscape shifts a little bit. We start to see other powers, mostly English, certainly, but we see other powers like the Portuguese. The Germans are finally going to get in on the mix a little bit. The Italians, of course, we covered a little bit. But the big two will be Britain and Germany in the East. Undoubtedly, Great Britain. And they become the chief rivals here. So we have Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor of great renown, known for realpolitik, just pragmatic politics. You know, you do what makes the most sense to achieve power. And if that means negotiating treaties and deals, then you do that. But if it means engaging in militaristic warfare, as you can probably see, to militarize, to crush those who are weaker than you, then you take the most efficient route to do so. And that doesn't always mean by engaging in war. Sometimes you can do that through a treaty, through a trade deal, through negotiation. He actually initially downplays the importance of colonies. You know, the whole idea for him was, you know, post-German Confederation, you know, trying to keep, you know, the German Empire German. You know, that was the big deal. But the idea of imperialism and colonization is so prevalent this time that he sees the people clamor for it. And as the people clamor for it, you know, this idea that you can expound the boundaries and bring in new opportunities for maybe an overpopulated area that you control, as people can now move to these other areas to set up settlements and to seek out other economic opportunities. He becomes something of a convert. And he says, quote, "All this colonial business is a sham, but we need it for the elections." And that really shows the realpolitik, the real politics, right? The pragmatic politician that he is. I don't personally believe in this, but we have to do it because everybody else wants it. And if I want to stay in power, I have to placate my constituency, the populace. So in addition to some West African holdings, Germany is going to, you know, develop in the East, as we mentioned. They're going to compete against Portugal, parts of Belgium as they butt up against Belgium in the Central and Central Africa, England, of course. And they're all there for the same reasons. You know, they're looking for diamonds, they're looking for gold, they're looking for palm oil, they're looking for rubber. You know, these are the common things that they seek in the exploitation of raw materials throughout Africa. And the big thing that they seek, almost all of them, without exception, is to have a fair understanding of how we can carve up Africa while avoiding major war and conflict. They won't always be successful, these Europeans, in this endeavor. In fact, we're going to talk about that as well in this lecture series. So Otto von Bismarck is, like I said, a very pragmatic politician. And he is going to set up the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885. This is a huge pivotal moment because it's here that the rules and the guidelines and the claims for, you know, these various European powers are going to be set up. Not just in East Africa for the British and the Germans, but, you know, this is how King Leopold is going to, you know, essentially imperialize and have it established that, unlike most other nations, you know, the Belgian Congo is really, like I said, it's more like his private holdings, which is very different from these other colonies that are going to be split up and separated by these predominantly, you know, 7 European nations. You know, 8 technically, but really, let's be honest, the Spanish are a major non-player, and they're not really a major factor when it comes to the colonization of Africa. So, you know, we're going to see these powers carve up Africa. And in typical, European fashion, playing into the white man's burden narrative, no African delegates are going to be represented or present at the conference. So Africa is for European imperialization and colonization, to bring light to darkness, to uplift, to bring Christianity, to introduce technology. Yeah. So, and we're also going to see increasingly any voting rights that Africans had become accustomed to in certain regions as Europeans increasingly settle in and set up protectorates will be stripped away. And that's really the case of South Africa in particular. So in South Africa, we can see a rapid increase in white population. And this primarily is initiated by the Dutch. The Dutch in the 1600s initially set up shop in South Africa, and by 1865, the total white population of South Africa had risen to nearly 200,000 people. So we have a fairly substantial settlement going into South Africa of what becomes known as the Afrikaners, or the Boers. These are the Dutch settlers who have been born and raised in these settlements in South Africa, or in and around primarily Cape Town. We can see Cape Town in South Africa right here at the very tip of the Horn of South Africa. This was Dutch initially, and that's going to change as the British horn in on the Horn of Africa. And this happens after the Napoleonic Wars. Britain, we're going to see Wellington defeat Napoleon, and therefore all these former, French, and then, whatever colonies and territories that the French had taken over from the Dutch, the Spanish, etc., are going to default to some degree to the English, and the English are going to get in on this action in South Africa. And now the English are going to establish Cape Colony, which will eventually become the Union of South Africa as they spread more and more territory southwards and then northwards into burgeoning Central and East African society here. We're going to talk a lot about Rhodesia momentarily. So we have certain groups in South Africa that are absolutely worth noting. One such tribe would be the Zulu Nation. We're going to talk about them and how they sort of relate to the overall scheme of things. So speaking of schemes, the Dutch are, by the 1830s, kind of disgusted with British rule. There's a lot going on in the 1830s here, and we're going to talk about one in particular individual in a moment. But the Boers, the Afrikaners, if you want to call them that, that's fine. They are going to engage in what's known as the Great Trek to get away from British rule, from what becomes Cape Colony. So 1 out of every 5 Dutch-speaking South Africans joins this trek. They are going to settle into what becomes known as the Orange Free State and the Transvaal regions, which eventually will be taken over right here in this region. If we can see that from my map. And it's there that they are going to set up the South African Republic. Now, the Boers, they believe in white superiority. They believe that it's ordained by God. They're not alone in this thought process when it comes to the majority of these, white European colonizers. And as a result of this belief, This is where we start to see the stripping away of voting rights. This is where we start to see the reduction of native-born Africans, not the Afrikaners. They are native-born Africans from the Dutch settlers, but the pigmentation of their skin color is different, to say the least. They live a very different life, and they believe that black Africans should really just be laborers or servants. That is their place in society. They are to be treated as though they are children, and the Afrikaners their parents. They are going to guide them. And as a result, they are going to emulate kind of United States policy in the fact that they are going to put the indigenous peoples and sort of force them to live on reservations after securing, I guess you'd call land/peace treaties. Same thing with the United States and the Native Americans. But they're dubious. The treaties. They're not always with the full understanding of what they are actually about and the rights that the chieftains of these various tribes are signing away. One such group that the Boers have major issue with would be the Zulu people, the Zulu nation. In the early 19th century, the Zulus would become led under their most talented, famous leader, Shaka. Shaka Zulu, who we can see depicted here. There's a great movie from back in the day. I definitely think it's worth checking out if you want the grand narrative laid out. Shaka Zulu is an interesting individual. His mother is belonging to one tribe. His father was the chieftain of the Zulu tribe. And he is considered to be kind of an illegitimate bastard. So he lives with his mother's tribe, where he sort of befriends and is endeared to the leader of that tribe as the new leader of his mother's tribe as he gains power. He comes back to the Zulu tribe. They are going to defeat his brother, who is the legitimate leader of the Zulu nation, but there is some mischief, some belief that perhaps his legitimate brother had something to do with the death of his father, and this gives him sort of some leeway to come back to the Zulu tribe and right some wrongs. Well, he's not the leader of the tribe. The leader of his mother's tribe is going to take over control of the Zulu nation, but he also somehow dies under mysterious circumstances, and it's under this pretense that Shaka Zulu will secure leadership of the Zulu nation and some other surrounding tribes, and he introduces some military reforms. He's kind of a military genius. He's going to go up against the Boers, and then the Zulus will eventually go up against the British, but under his leadership and against the Boers, they are highly successful. You can see they are going to be going up against steel swords and firearms and machine guns with cowhide shields and a new innovation, the short spear, that he introduces. The idea of the short spear was that you could throw it, it gives you a little bit of range, but as you get in close, and this is something that is a new introduction as far as combat in Africa goes, as you get in close, you can engage more readily in hand-to-hand combat because the length of that spear is no longer limited. The problem with the spear and its length is that as you get closer and closer to your opponent, it becomes a less viable weapon. You don't have the range or the ability to lunge and to attack. Now, as you get closer, you do. So this is a major innovation, along with his military tactics. And there's no doubt there's a need for this kind of military change because as the Zulus are competing now against the Dutch and eventually the British, European settlers, there's less land to farm. There's more pressure on raiding other tribes to trade the cattle, which the Europeans, of course, are highly value. So there's more money attached to them. And of course, the farms, the land that's being used for European crops, well, sometimes they fail, which can lead to famine. And now this means that we need to raid to obtain other foodstuffs from perhaps more prosperous settlements and or tribes. So the face of African warfare changes as a result of the increasing population pressure that the Zulus are feeling from, the Dutch settlers. So the biggest thing is the bull formation that Shaka Zulu is going to form. And he is basically going to have 4 units. One unit is the head of the bull, as he calls it. The head of the bull charges, and it's supposed to pin down the opposition. And this is going to be used both against other tribes as well as against the Dutch. So they hold them there into close range melee combat. Then you have the horns, which are 2 sides that flank the head of the bull, the main body, and they attack from either side as they flank the enemy's position. And then you have the loins, as he calls it. The loins are basically just a reserve unit. They're to turn their backs, actually, to combat so as not to charge in over-eager and to wait for his signal to basically, if a group of the horns on the left side or the right side gets tired, then the loins can come in and replace them, or even, the head of the bull, if you will. And it's with these tactics that he's incredibly successful. He leads stunning defeat after stunning defeat to the Boers, and eventually they are going to all but quit as they sort of carve out their own African empire under his leadership. But after his leadership, things decline. The cult of personality is not there. They are still powerful, but the British have learned the lessons of the Boers and their various defeats, and so the British will be ultimately successful when they join the conflict in defeating the Zulu. And this is going to lead us to our last individual we'll be discussing, Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodes Colossus, a play on words. His dream was to establish a continuous English settlement that, one, protects their interest in the Nile River over here, but also leads to an inland train route from South to North Africa, from Egypt, as he called it, from Cairo to Cape Town, right, from North to South Africa. And these lands that were previously controlled by groups like the Zulu, and then, the Boers, they will eventually become under the control, as you can see, of the English, Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes. He comes over to South Africa and Cape Town when he's about 17 years old. He's very young. He wants to make money. He has a heart attack when he's 19. 19, he has a heart attack. And he knew then that his health was in such poor condition that he would have to put his everything into achieving his economic dreams and goals as quickly as possible. And this means, of course, engaging in violence and exploitation. He once said, quote, "I think what God would like me to do is to paint as much of Africa British red as possible." And he is going to find a child playing with a diamond in his early days in South Africa. And it's from then on that he's going to invest everything into the diamond industry, forming the De Beers Company. And the De Beers Mining Company, in a short span of time, will control 90% of the diamond market. And because of this is going to lead to mistreatment of both the Africans as well as the Boers, the Afrikaners, the white Dutch, Africans in this region. And it will lead to conflicts as he secures more and more power and territory. And what becomes known as the famous James Raid, where he basically just gives guns to a bunch of British settlers and says, you know what, go over and take that Transvaal government. It initially fails the raid, and he loses his power as basically the prime minister, the head of the Cape Colony. But it's going to lead to increased conflict because he's incredibly wealthy. He is ultimately going to help secure the territory And this is where we're going to see that region become known and named as Rhodesia. But war, and we'll discuss this next session, will break out between the British and the Boers because of his actions and his decisions. But that is going to be saved for our next and final lecture in this 3-part series. See you all